This is our second component of our Unit 6, which included both the Victorian era as well as the 20th century and 21st century eras. We've already had a video on the Victorian segment. If you haven't watched that one, you'll need to go back and watch that one. This video begins our intro lecture series on the modern and postmodern periods. It will be divided into more than one segment. So let's go ahead and get started on this one today. So we see that this particular part of the unit deals with the death of Victoria to the modern time. So 1901 to the present. Here is Victoria's lineage all the way to the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. So Elizabeth II's father was George VI. His brother, Edward VIII, ruled for a while. Their father was George V. His father was Victoria's son, Edward VII, and then there's Queen Victoria. So you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 generations separating Queen Victoria from the current monarch, Elizabeth II. When Edward VII came to power after his mother died in 1901, Britain was no longer the only major manufacturer in the world. Germany, the United States, and Japan had all begun the industrial process. Britain began suffering unemployment, so the Labour Party began to work for the end of poverty through many government programs. The German Empire determined to build a powerful navy, however, and began to threaten Britain's existence. So to protect itself, Britain formed the Triple Entente. It joined with France and Russia in 1907 in this agreement. Later on, more countries joined, and it was simply known as the Entente. The driving power behind the new British government was a powerful prime minister named David Lloyd George. He began the Old Age Pension Act in 1908. Lloyd George imposed heavy taxes on the rich to pay for his social programs. And the House of Lords, made up primarily of these rich people, rejected his budget. So a constitutional struggle took place in Britain that ended in the Parliament Act of 1911, which really stripped the House of Lords of a lot of its power. After that, House of Commons had most of the power in the country. In 1912, with the House of Commons mostly in charge, their National Insurance Act was passed. Edward VII died in 1910, and his son George V succeeded. As World War I began, Britain was faced with many different problems. Of course, we had working men strikes and the Irish movement for independence. Women wanted the right to vote, but war broke out in 1914, and all of those issues had to be ignored to focus on the war effort. After the war, of course, these issues came back up again. Women finally received the right to vote in 1928 in Britain, and all of Ireland except that northeastern part called Northern Ireland got independence in 1922. In World War I, of course, Britain lost a major part of a generation of young men. After the war, there was increasing unemployment. In 1918, the year the war ended, the Education Act was passed to allow for free public education in all grades. A general strike was called in 1926, creating further economic depression. Well, George V died in January of 1936. And something strange happened in 1936. They had 3 different monarchs. So the father died in January of that year. The elder son succeeded as Edward VIII, did not last the year, and stepped down in favor of his own brother. So we'll talk about that. Before his coronation, the new king, Edward VIII, announced his intention of marrying a divorced American lady, Wallis Simpson. Parliament disapproved of this marriage because she had been divorced, and the king is declared the head of the Church of England. So they did not think it looked good for a king to take over the country with a divorced wife, which is very ironic since the Church of England really started because Henry VIII wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't give him one. People liked him. He was a very popular king. Most regular citizens thought he should be allowed to continue ruling. But Parliament basically said you can have the woman or you can have the throne. And he said, I'll take the woman. Now, as time went on, we learned much more about all of this, and we found out that Churchill and a number of others of his group decided they were going to get rid of Edward VIII as quickly as they could because Edward VIII had pro-German sympathies, and they knew that war with Germany was coming very quickly, and they did not want a puppet of Adolf Hitler sitting on the British throne. And so they made Edward and his new wife the governor and governess of the Bahamas, and sent them away. And Edward and his wife basically went on cruises and did charity events for most of their lives, but they were out of the royal family. And so that meant that his brother, George VI, who really never wanted to become king, became king and did his duty, succeeded. He often had a stuttering problem, and of course kings have to make a lot of speeches, but he moved right on. As the saying went, keep calm and carry on. He did the best he could, and people loved him and admired him for it. And that is the current queen's father, George VI. Of course, Germany had been left very poor by World War I, and the people looked to Hitler to restore their pride. Well, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed he could achieve peace with Hitler. But 6 months after their agreement, Hitler began to invade other European countries. In 1939, World War II began and lasted until 1945. In 1940, Winston Churchill succeeded as Prime Minister. A result of World War II really was the end of the concept of empire. And the Great Britain, many countries once held by the British got their independence in the 1940s, some later on in the 1950s, others in the 1960s. Britain's attention after the war had to be turned inward. A national health and unemployment insurance was created. The banks were nationalized. Communication facilities were nationalized. The economy was truly socialized into more of a democratic socialism. Britain became a welfare state. Most of the former colonies, though, wanted to maintain a good tie to Britain, and they formed an economic union called the Commonwealth of Nations. There are over 50 nations in the Commonwealth of Nations. Other names that we hear about, of course, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had begun in 1922, but it was in the 1950s that Russia, the Soviet Union, really starts flexing its muscles and starting to take over a lot of Eastern Europe. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed with the United States taking the lead to try to combat the growing expansion of the Soviet Empire. So the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe, and the United States began to take the lead in directing the rest of the free world. So in 1949, we established NATO to battle the increasing expansion of the Soviet Union. So as of 2012, and this number hasn't changed very much since then, the Commonwealth includes 54 countries. There are some countries who have applied to join who really weren't even part of the old British Empire, but they hope that they can maintain a good, close relationship with the United Kingdom. No longer was Britain the leading world power in the 1950s. Of course, the United States took a big lead in that. We do know that King George VI and his wife, whose name was also Elizabeth, they named their daughter Elizabeth as well, were loved by the country for not having left Britain when the bombings occurred in World War II. After a bombing, the king and queen would often visit the sites with their two daughters. But in 1952, George VI died, and his elder daughter succeeded as Elizabeth II, having her coronation in 1953, and she has been ruling ever since. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, almost all the remaining territories of the world held by Britain got their independence, including South Africa and some South American countries. The 1960s in Britain, though, saw economic troubles mounting again. Britain could no longer afford to remain isolated economically from Europe, and ties to Europe certainly would increase. The 1970s. In 1973, Britain entered the European Economic Community. Throughout the 1970s, tensions increased, though, in Northern Ireland. The Catholic minority there has always wanted independence. The Protestant majority, though, wants to remain united with Great Britain, with the United Kingdom. Troubles began to build with the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, the militant Catholic organization that fights against British rule. In 1979, the first woman Prime Minister for Britain was elected. Margaret Thatcher leader of the Conservative Party. And working with President Ronald Reagan of the United States, closer ties between Britain and America were formed. In 1982, Britain went to war against Argentina over the Falkland Islands, a territory claimed by both countries off the coast of South America. The British won after 10 weeks. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher was elected to an unprecedented third term. In the 1980s, the IRA engaged in a series of bombings around London to protest the British rule over Northern Ireland. Queen Elizabeth's son Charles married Diana Spencer and had 2 sons, William and Harry, to continue the royal line. Margaret Thatcher resigned in 1990 when her party officials told her that she would probably be unable to win another election, and they wanted her to go out on top, looking like a winner. Our next video will cover the 1990s to the present time.